Now, as to black people, in addition to being 2 million in prison and 50% of that, we have an infant mortality rate that's the same when Dr. King talked about it in 1967, and that is double the rate of infant mortality for white people, white children. 65% of the women and children with AIDS are black. We are dying, black people are dying, black men die of prostate cancer at double the levels of white men in America, but actually die at a higher rate of prostate cancer of any men in the world, black men in America. Black women are dying of breast cancer and cervical cancer, double and quadruple the rates of white women. We have the lowest education levels in the United States. I want to talk a little bit about that in a minute. We have the highest poverty rates, and less than 1% of all business revenues in the United States come from black-owned businesses. So the question is the same. Why? Must be something wrong with black people. America's a place, they tell you. Vietnamese come here and they make it. Koreans come here and they make it. Everybody can come in America. America's a place of opportunity. Everybody can be president if you really want to. Now let me tell you something. I doubt that anybody in this room is going to be president. I'm going to just put money on that one right now, okay? Because I don't think anybody here has got the money to roll that hard, okay? You got to have some money up in here to be president of the United States, okay? And all you women, I don't care what you think about Hillary, that girl plays hardball, okay? She's in the old boys club, in the new boys club at that. The question is why then? Why is this true? Is there something wrong with black people? And we had questions like this raised. I know people say, no, that can't be true, but then why is it true? For example, remember when the Bell Curve came out in 1994, some of you may remember this, some of you may not, but the Bell Curve was a book, 800-some page book written by two professors who really did not have the credentials to talk about behavioral science, which is what IQ falls under, because it's not an exact science, it's a behavioral question, but that's another conversation. But the bottom line is, in the Bell Curve, these two professors put forward the idea that black people were inherently intellectually inferior to white people. Inherently. Biologically, genetically, inferior intellectually to black people. And people began to debate this as though it were true. And they said, well, wait a minute, but look what they proposed. They said, look, black people fail the SAT at such high rates and white people pass, and they use these tests and various others to say, because of these tests, these Stanford, Binet, and all these other little tests, that black people have, it's clear, are intellectually inferior genetically. And there's no point in putting any money into public education for us anymore, because you cannot educate these people because they're inferior. And people are like, but why don't black people pass the SAT at the same rate of white people? And black people, some black people said things like, well, it's because the test is culturally biased. Like black people can't read English, they have to have black English, like, who be there? You know what I'm saying? And then we would understand it, right? So it's culturally biased, or whatever that meant. And nobody thought that the whole notion, they didn't even start with the premise of what was intelligence. What is intelligence? Well, that would be, we don't know. We don't know what intelligence is. We have no real standard, no objective, no scientific basis for even beginning to discuss intelligence. Now, I always say that I live in Georgia, and in Georgia, if you're a single mom and you have a child and you don't have any money and you go on welfare, you'll get $300 a month to live on. And I figure if you figure out how to get through the month on $300, you've got to be a genius, okay? Because there's no way in hell that anybody can realistically live on $300 a month, even with food stamps and whatever else there is going on with that. So we actually say to ourselves, well, why is it? So the first thing we have to do is realize that there is no measure for intelligence. People they studied, Einstein's brain, put it in a jar. Anybody know about this? Put Einstein's brain in a jar, looked at it for 25, 35 years, had the man's brain. I think they just finally got rid of it or did something. I don't know what they did, but they had it preserved in some pickled something, and they examined. No, I'm not making this stuff up. Can I get a witness? Somebody knows what I'm talking about. They had that stuff in a jar. They said, why was he so brilliant? What was it about the brain? Let's look at it, as though they were going to have. And Einstein was almost would have been considered autistic at this point, because he didn't speak for the first 9 years or so of his life. And then when he comes up with E equals MC squared, he said, I had a vision about it in a dream. And they were like, what does that mean? He said, that's what it means. So people just, it's a study. Well, what made... So we don't even really know what intelligence is. But now we're going to measure intelligence though we can't define it, and we're going to use a test like the SAT. And what is the SAT test? Well, it used to be the Scholastic Aptitude Test, as though it measured your ability, aptitude, right? And there was a Scholastic Assessment Test, like it just measured what you could do some kind of way. But ultimately it just became the SAT. We don't even know what it stands for. We just know we have to take it. But somebody says if you don't get a high SAT, you can't get into college. That and a couple $1,000. But unless your daddy gave some money to the school, or you can play football, or your grandfather went there, or your grandmother went there, something like this. Otherwise, you got to take the SAT. You don't get in like George Bush did. You got to take your SAT, and you got to pay your money. Now I know this is a state school, but I was just at Occidental College. They're up to almost $48,000 a year for tuition. So everybody doesn't care to get piece together $48,000 a year in a loan or something else. You're going to be denied that. But anyway, so the SAT defines, according to Herrnstein and Murray, the authors of the Bell Curve, defines intelligence, and the success ratio tells us that black folks are inherently inferior. This is almost unbelievable that there was an argument and debate about this. But as a result, policy began to change in this country. And people began to say, well, no child should be left behind. These people have to take more tests. You know what I'm saying? We're not going to put any money into fixing up the schools, lowering the class size, paying teachers more. Elementary school teachers being treated like they are babysitters, which actually babysitters should be paid more also, but that's another conversation. You're taking care of somebody's child. Seems like you might want to put a little money into that, I always advocate for elementary schools teachers to have a starting salary of about $150,000 because those are the most important moments in history. Right now, you got my 5-year-old child in there, and you're going to end up having Kip Kinkle or somebody because you got 30-some children to deal with, and you can't deal with all these children in there. You shouldn't have any more than 10 or 12 children in the classroom. You should have some resources that you need and so forth and so on. But we don't do any of that. So here's the bell curve saying. And so the end of the day, we find that the SAT test doesn't measure anything. Dr. Richard Atkinson, if you don't believe me, it doesn't matter. But Dr. Richard Atkinson, who was then president of the University of California, who was very trained in this field, said that the ratio between those who passed the test and those who failed the test was very simple. Those who took the SAT test-taking course seemed to do very well in taking the SAT. In other words, as we used to say with computers, garbage in, garbage out. Because the SAT measures nothing other than how well you take the SAT test. Most people who take the test don't know very much about anything. Except for, people even say, that looks like an SAT vocabulary word, you know what I'm saying? As though I'm not going to think about it, it's just involving that test, okay? Most of us don't know the history of this country. Most of us know very little, but we can do well. And I was professional at taking these kinds of tests because I went to the kind of school in Philadelphia where we were all the special children. We went to little special schools and all this stuff about how I got into there, but there's another conversation. But the bottom line is I did go there, and we took those tests, sample tests, all day long. I'm so good at those tests that years later I took the LSAT, Law School Aptitude Assessment, whatever test, and I came in like the top 2%. People were like, how'd you do it? I said, I could teach my dog Spot to take the LSAT and do well in it. And here's Spot, here's these biscuits. Now look, just go on like this. I'm going to give you a biscuit for every one of these, please. It's a test. It doesn't measure anything. But we began to think that black people were inherently inferior. And even when we heard about the Human Genome Project's results, the results of the Human Genome Project showed that there's no relationship between, certainly not intelligence, behavior, anything else. Most things are environmentally influenced. Most things are environmentally influenced. People thought there would be about 140-some thousand genetic markers, but it turns out there were only 30,000. So after you take away your hair, the color of your skin, your eyes, your teeth, your nose, the fact that you have 2 arms instead of 4, the fact that you're walking on your hind legs or on your legs as opposed to all 4 or something, and you have 5 fingers on each hand, and all that stuff, by the time you finish with that, the differences are so few, it's almost incredible. As a matter of fact, Dr. Craig Venter, who was one of the co-directors of the Human Genome Project, suggests that black people in America have a greater similarity to white people in America than they do to Africans in Africa because of environmental influence. Now, I know that's hard for people to believe, but just read about the Human Genome Project. You'll learn a little something there. The next time, we had Bill Clinton coming and weighing in on this, because Bill Clinton in 1993, in November of 93, said, look, he was standing in the church where Martin Luther King gave his last speech in Memphis. And Bill Clinton standing there talking about, well, this is the church where Dr. King gave his last speech. And he says, and I'm wondering, saying to all this black congregation, I'm wondering if Martin Luther King were here today, what would he say? You know, in the black church, we have what we call call and response. So the church said, well, so Martin Luther King said, what would he say? Now Bill Clinton's going to tell us what Martin Luther King would have said, which is amazing to me in and of itself. But anyway, so here's Bill Clinton saying, if Martin Luther King was standing by my side today, what would he say? He would say, I died for your freedom, and look what you've done with it. Talking to black people. And all the people in the audience were like, oh, Lord, look what we've done. What have we done, actually, Bill? And Bill said, look at the breakdown of the black family, all this black-on-black crime, and all of these unwed black mothers. This is your problem. America is not a problem. The scheme here is perfect. Everybody has opportunity. Something wrong with you. You need to fix yourselves and get your families back into shape and stop having all these babies out of wedlock and stop committing this crime. And I'm getting ready to help you. I'm going to pass the 3 strikes crime bill with your help so that you can start putting some of these horrible people in prison who run around your streets intimidating all your people. We're not going to fix poverty because that's your fault. You should have got a job. We're not going to fix hunger. If you had worked, you could have feed your children. There's nothing wrong with America. There's something wrong with black people, and we're going to fix it by putting that. And the next thing we're going to do is a welfare reform bill. And we're going to make sure these lazy girls laying up having all these babies out of wedlock, we're not going to pay for them anymore. We are sick and tired of paying for these lazy girls. We forgot that there were more than black girls because the majority of women who were criminalized by the Clinton welfare reform bill were white women. Poor white women living in the hollows of Kentucky and in the hills of Watsonville, for all I know, you know, wherever. Okay? Living around here. So what I'm saying is that Clinton began to shift the design to even something worse in the sense that he created the conditions for people to say, listen, your poverty is your fault. This is not our fault anymore, and America is not going to try to fix any of this stuff. We're not going to worry about any health care. We're not going to worry about any poverty. If you get a job and stop being lazy and trifling, and that's what's wrong with black people, he said then. And then we had weighing in during the same period a guy named John DiIulio, who along with William Bennett, the former Secretary of Education, who now has a show on radio or something, whatever, you know. William Bennett and John DiIulio talked about the coming of the super predator, the young black criminal who was worse, and they were big more and more, and they were younger and younger and more violent, and we needed to do something. And so added to the omnibus crime bill that Clinton had was the idea that we're going to put children in prison as adults. You do big boy crime, you're going to do big boy time. That's how they talk. They like to talk tough. Pete Wilson gave us that line, you know. And a person who didn't pass the law school, didn't pass the bar test for about 3 or 4 times, but let me not go into that part about him, because he's no longer governor. We now have a legal immigrant as the governor of California. Don't get confused about the illegal immigrants. But anyway, so DiIulio and Bennett give us the term super predator. And so when we look at all of this, we find that with the Clinton bill and with the DiIulio thing and with the bell curve, we find that there's this notion that these black boys are not only dumb and backward and criminal, but we're going to have to do something to get rid of all these bad boys on the street. And so let's start locking some people up. And then you end up with 2 million people. The prison population in the United States doubled from the time that Clinton put out his, in 10 years from the time of Clinton's, from 1994 to 2004. The prison population doubled. The correct analysis is what we have to look at, and that's what I'm hoping that we'll take away tonight, is that we have to have a correct analysis of things. You know, I had a group of young white, I was at Plattsburgh, New York. I don't know if you've ever been to Plattsburgh. It's the end of the world. The farthest reaches, you know, it really is. It's like, you're in Plattsburgh, you're just living in, I mean, this is just like, it's very poor. Plattsburgh poor. I was speaking at the State University of New York, SUNY, called SUNY New York, Plattsburgh, and all the kids there were like little, like a lot of little Timothy McVeighs sitting out there looking at me like I was crazy. So I'm like, oh, who the hell, how did I get here? So after I made my little speech and everything, these young guys said to me, yeah, you're talking all this stuff about black people this and black people that, but what about white people like me? What about me? I have a middle-class family. My mother and father, they had good jobs, and they worked hard and everything, and I tried to get into a school, and I was more qualified than a black kid, and he got in, even though he wasn't as qualified as I am, because he was black because of affirmative action. Don't you think that's unfair? So he thought that was like a trick question, you know. So I said, well, of course it's unfair. But it's not unfair for the reasons that you think it's unfair. You want me to say that it's unfair because you were more qualified and the black kid shouldn't have gotten in because of merit. But the first thing you have to do is have a correct analysis in order for you to understand what happened. So the first piece of your argument, you have a flawed analysis because the first thing you said was that you're middle class. You're not middle class. You're poor. You'd like to be middle class. You'd like to think, because everybody tries to squeeze into that other category, you know, when it's like black, white, or other. And if you're not really white, you're trying to squeeze into other because you know you don't want to be over there with black people. You know, people who are black and Filipino. Oh, no, I'm more other. You know what I'm saying? You know, if I got anything other than black in me, I'm over there with other because I don't want to be categorized as black, and I know I can't go past for white. And so that's what you are. You want to be middle class, but in fact you're poor. Because if you had $40-some thousand, you could go to Harvard. You don't have any money. That's why you down here scraping with me over this one little slot in the school, down here with some black folks trying to vie for that one slot in school. So what is really unfair is that there is only one slot. There should have been a place for everybody. Why couldn't both of you have gone to school together? Why couldn't we have a society in which nobody has to pay to go and get a higher education? Because we believe that we want to educate our people so that we will know how to vote for somebody who's not going to kill everybody in the world before we all become 22 years old. If we knew how to go to school, if we all went to school, maybe we could be thinking, why do we want to deny people the right to go to school if you don't have money, if you haven't passed the SAT or anything else? Let everybody go. We all went to elementary school. We all went to junior high school. Why is it we can't all go to college if we want to? And so I said, so that's what's wrong. That by design, this is a scheme that says I'm going to pit one white boy against one black boy, and I'm going to say whoever wins, fight it out, duke it out. I don't care because I'm only going to create one more slot. And today it's going to be the black boy slot. And yesterday, for the last couple hundred years, it was the white boy slot anyway. Let's just talk very briefly about the history of this country and how we got to this place. Because the reason this is important, now I know a lot of people's eyes start glazing over when I start talking about the history of the country because they're like, is she going to go into slavery again? Just like, well, you know, as I mentioned, I lived in France. And in 1994, while I was living there was a guy named Paul Toubier who was put on trial. He was he had been a leader, well, not a leader, I guess a leader, but he had been in a hierarchy of the Vichy government. I assume you've studied the Vichy government, probably not. But anyway, that was the government that was sort of the Nazi, colonial, the sort of neo-colonial Nazis. In other words, they were the local French who were supporting the Nazi government after the Germans ran through the north of France. The French said, no more, no more. Some of them fought, but the majority of them laid down and said, look, if you just leave us the rest of France, don't destroy the Louvre, don't destroy Paris, we will allow you to occupy France, which, of course, the Germans did. And in the south of France, there was the establishment of the Vichy government, which was not the French government, but it was the French government controlled by the Germans. And so this guy, Paul Toubier, had been an operative at the highest level, second only really to Klaus Barbie, who was known as the Butcher of Lyon. People know that. I heard somebody say that. Butcher of Lyon. So this guy goes on trial. They find him. He's sitting there drinking wine in Bordeaux, just having a good time. He's about 90 years old now. And so, you know, some Nazi hunters found him, and they brought him to trial in France. Well, the French, being very ambivalent about what their real relationship was in World War II, many of the French journalists and so forth did not want to see this man go on trial because they didn't want to resurrect this history. So we don't need to discuss this history and what we did in France. Well, we had the underground, really. They had about 4 people in the underground, really. Because, you know, de Gaulle himself was somewhere else other than in France. But anyway, so they put Toubier on trial. The French were like, no, we can't keep on talking about this. He's old, the war is over, let's get over this. Can't we just turn the page and keep on going? You know the way we say in America, let's get over it, move on. We don't ever want to look back at anything. And so French prosecutors said, yes, we've got to turn the page of history. You're right. But we cannot turn the page of history until we write the page. We got to look at what's going on in this country. We can't pretend this stuff doesn't happen. That's why we can't understand what's going on. And we're like, well, why can't we all get along? We can't all get along because there's a historical reality here. And so very briefly, we have to look at how did black people come to be in the condition that we're in today? Was this a fluke? Is there some genetic flaw? And if there isn't, is there something wrong in the scheme of things, in the design of things in this country? And we have to look quickly at that. And I just want to revisit some of that history because we have to know that when we talk about, for example, immigrants, now you know black people did not come here looking for freedom of religion. We did not come in here talking about we want to create colonies for the English crown. We came in here kicking and screaming, being captive slaves from Africa by a scheme of men who were looking to create a market economy and in fact did create a market economy so that by the time you get to 1776 you have 150 years of African slavery and a country that is founded as a slave-holding nation. Now, if we don't recognize that, then we'll pretend that that's not true. We'll think, well, yeah, but, so what that Jefferson was a slaveholder and half the people that signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were slaveholders. Matter of fact, more than half. So what? It's still a good idea. These were brilliant men. They were men of their time. So we just go past that 150 years of slavery like it was nothing. And then we move forward to 1865. Excuse me. By the time... the country becomes an independent country, by the way, written into the Constitution. Not only is it legal to hold slaves, but it's illegal to try to be free. Biggest crime a black person could commit was trying to run away from a slave master. It was a crime. And it was a crime for white people to help black people to run away. Matter of fact, it was a crime for a white the only time a black man, anything happened to a black man that would be a crime for a white man to commit was when he killed another man's slave. You had all kinds of little codes and stuff going on. This is a country founded on slavery. Now, this is not like, well, it's not your fault. This is not about fault. It's about reality. This is what the country was founded on. This is how it founded, how it developed. It became a market economy. The South Carolina rice planters alone were richer than the majority of the kings and queens of Western Europe at the time once the Declaration of Independence was written. These men had money. Oglethorpe, who was the founder of Georgia and so forth and so on, very, very rich because of slaves, cotton, indigo, sugar, rice, so forth and so on, agricultural economic base. By 1865, we find that blacks, 13th Amendment, the Civil War is over, blacks are theoretically free, the abolition of slavery on the 13th Amendment, same time you have the black codes coming into power, and really nothing shifted. There was a moment when General Sherman in 1865 issued Field Order number 15 saying, I want to see all these lands from along this coast, these some miles, 30 miles inland. I want to see all these lands redistributed among the black former slaves so that families at 40 acres of slave families so that each one of them will have something to start their lives with. And what happened? Nothing, because we know nobody got the 40 acre. A few people did. They held on to them. Some of them living in Georgia right now. But most people some people went to those lands, and most of them were run off the lands by the new President Johnson by the end of 1865. And you had the rise of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, and you had the rise of the black codes, which governed black life. And so black folks went forward through the rest of that year, to the rest of the century rather, basically going to jail because of vagrancy, because they did not conform to the black codes, did not get the 40 acres, did not get any rights, and then after 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, black people suddenly found out that separate was equal. This was America, the beginning of American apartheid, and so we find ourselves coming into the 20th century as basically an oppressed people. We have no land, we have no housing, we can't discriminate against housing, can't get a job. All the European immigrants coming into the end of the year, one thing they all learned, whether they were Irish or Italian or Lithuanians or French or German or anything else, they learned they were white people when it came to black people and make sure that we didn't get a job anywhere on the railroad or anything else. All the unions that were formed by the 20th century were beginning to form together. They were fighting, the gangs of New York and all that stuff. But then one thing they all agreed on, let's not let the black folks in. So black people fought for jobs. We fought against lynching. We fought against the Ku Klux Klan. We fought against all this stuff just to survive. Getting to 1954, we have little Elaine Brown in Topeka, Kansas, saying separate is not equal in public education. And what happens? The Supreme Court says, you're right, let's desegregate the schools. Blood is shed all over the country. Children trying to go to school in Massachusetts and Mississippi can't go to school with white people. White people don't want to see anybody black sitting next to them. Eisenhower himself actually said, it's hard for me to imagine a black man sitting next to a little white girl. You know, it's like the big black buck sitting next to the little white girl, like something terrible is going to happen, all this stuff. This is a terrible moment. You need to know that. People bled and died just for trying to get a little education, thinking if I get an education, I might get a job. 55, we had the great moment when Rosa Parks sits on the bus like Plessy in Plessy versus Ferguson tried to sit on the train in Louisiana, and she's told that she has to sit in the back of the bus. She's not fighting to own the bus, own the land, get a job, just a seat on the bus because I paid the same price. And then we get the voice of Martin Luther King saying America has to be ashamed of itself. How can you have a whole people be denied at this level? And so we get the beginnings of what we now refer to as the civil rights movement in the late 50s and the early 60s, and Martin Luther King finally in 1963, in that great moment in 63 calling for America to come. You know, there was a promise, he says in the beginning of that I Have a Dream speech, there was a promise that has not been kept as to black people. Ultimately, we get the 64, 65 Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, and we find that black people now have, quote, civil rights. And Martin Luther King says in 67, he says, yes, we might have our civil rights, but I'm looking out in America and I see that we have half of what is good, we black people, and double of what is bad. Where do we go from here? Black Panther Party, SNCC, all kinds of organizations began to fight and talk about something. But in the Black Panther Party, we talked about fundamental change, change of design, change of the scheme. Something was wrong. And it wasn't just black people. It was Chicanos, and it was Native Americans, and it was Puerto Ricans, and it was poor whites, because we had a coalition with something called the Young Patriot Party, kind of like left-leaning Timothy McVeigh's, not to be confused with the SDS and so forth and so on. And we formed coalitions, and we talked about making a change in the scheme of things, because it was that scheme of capitalism and racism that had created the conditions under which we lived. By 1966, we were still an oppressed people, still couldn't get housing, still couldn't get medical care, still couldn't get decent education, and so forth and so on. So the question becomes, when we look over the scope of the history of black people in America, and we can see it more clearly than we can with other groups. Somebody asked me, said, well, you talk sometimes about reparations for blacks. What about the Native Americans? I said, give them the whole country back as far as I'm concerned. I'm fine with that. I'm prepared to go somewhere else, or I'm prepared to pay rent. You know, I pay rent anyway. So I say give every single acre back to the Native people, okay? Then people get scared when you say stuff like that. They're like, are you speaking of downtown Chicago too? You know, yes. And what about, people say, well, what about the Irish immigrants who came here and how they were murdered and killed trying to build this country in the industrial? I said, give them some reparations too. I don't care. I'm fine with that too. Because in the end of the day, as Dr. King called for in the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, which was the real dream he had, and if we really remember, he wasn't killed when he was talking about the 1963 March on Washington. He was killed talking about the 1968 March, in the Poor People's Campaign. Whosoever will, let him come. If you're black, if you're white, if you're Latino, whatever, come on and let's talk about how we're going to Washington and we're going to cash our check, one that's owed to all of us who are poor in this country and sitting here trying to figure out how we're going to make ends meet. And we're calling for guaranteed income, guaranteed health care, and ultimately the redistribution of the wealth of this nation so that everybody can have what he needs. And that's what Martin Luther King talked about, and that was his dream that we have all had erased from our memory. And that was the dream of the Black Panther Party, to change things to the point where we said we want a different world and a better world, where there's a promise that is really kept. And in order to do that, we said we would have to make the kinds of changes and organize. And people called us the terrorists of that time, J. Edgar Hoover. FBI came down on us with COINTELPRO, with guns and everything else. The CIA came down on us. Everybody and their mother tried to destroy the Black Panther Party, and ultimately did, because we were calling for that kind of change, and we had other people coming with us, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. So I think the question that I want to close by raising here is just simply saying, what kind of a world do we want to live in? And I think that what we want to do is change the world to such a place that by design everybody does get his or her needs met, and we can get back to the promise and the reality that we have a right to a life of liberty and happiness. Thank you very much.